everyone, welcome to the CollabCast. I'm editor Katie Cusack here with editor David King and Nicole Van Slyke, WMHT videographer. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nicole was also nominated for our Capital Region Creatives Under 40. Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. You've done a lot of important work in terms of documentary filmmaking in the area, most notably one that people will recognize is The Dragon Lives Here in collaboration with the Times-Union. What was it like to sort of walk into a project like that and take it on?
I think it was a gift because I just started at WMHT and it was my first day that project was handed to me. And then I reached out to Paul Grondel, who was at the Times-Union at that time, and we started having a conversation. And there was just starting to open up the space on the internet where documentaries could kind of have a place. And WMHT was just starting to play with that, so there were no boundaries yet. So we got to really push ourselves with the web team and with the Times-Union to try to get out in the community and find stories that needed to be told without sticking to the parameters of the half hour or the hour that were on television. So that was a fun experiment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this was sort of like your first introduction to more of like a journalistic aspect of filmmaking as well. What was it like to, talk to these families and people who are out and about and in that community and struggling with that?
Heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It was really heartbreaking. It was a story that at the time, so what is that, 3 years ago now, I think it came out. We thought that maybe it had been overtold and people were going to get sick of the heroin story and the opioid story was coming to an end, and but we weren't even close to the end of it, is what we knew. So the reason that I started studying film and storytelling in the digital medium was because I wanted to be able to give a voice to people who didn't have a voice. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that, if it was going to be through documentaries or through web programming. I just knew that I wanted to study that area. And so when I got out there and I started talking to these people who were on methadone or had just lost a child that nobody really wanted to talk to, I realized that just to let them speak and to be there and let them have a chance to tell their story and the perspective they were coming from was going to be a hard thing to just not cry and not interrupt and let them tell the story.
Yeah, to let them work through it on their own. And that's something that I know we talked about in our initial interview, is sort of how compelling documentary is in that way, to let people speak for themselves and to have that. Did you have any experience beforehand in sort of like more feature work or fictional or creative projects? Or
my creative background from college, I did my undergrad at RPI and I studied animation. And I worked on a team called Nanotune that made the molecularium. So I made molecules and oxygen molecules speak to each other. And there was a lot of I'm a noble gas kind of jokes made with molecules that had monocles. It's a hard sentence to say. So I did a lot of that stuff. And I think it was when I was doing that stuff, I realized I had a talent and a like for the medium, or the ability to create stuff on a screen in a digital way. But I really wanted to be outside of the walls of an animation studio and tell real stories, not fiction stories. So I slowly backed away, well, actually pretty quickly backed away from telling the fictional side of stuff.
Yeah. And I know you also were involved in a lot of video and media education as well. You want to talk about some of that background?
Yeah.
You started at boarding school, I believe?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
So it transitioned from animation into AmeriCorps, which is a really big jump because I was just doing entrepreneurship in inner city schools. And I joined AmeriCorps for 3 years because I wanted to get out in the community. And when I was in that space, I was given an opportunity to manage a digital team of high school students who wanted to send videos to their congressmen and to their school teachers and people who they wanted to share messages with that they felt like weren't listening to them. So in that process, I taught them how to video edit, and I taught them how to hold a camera and how to conduct an interview, and how to say just simple stuff like action or cut. And we went through that whole process, and I realized that more than making a film, teaching somebody how to make a film gave even more voices to people who didn't have the ability to necessarily be heard or to speak up. So they were able to make these really quality pieces that were listened to more than if they just took out their cell phone and went on a rant and edit that together. So then I went to school for teaching and learning through digital media and documentary filmmaking. And then I ended up at a boarding school in Connecticut teaching documentary filmmaking and graphics. And then up here.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned sort of like talking to an iPhone camera. I mean, I feel like that's super popular nowadays, where everybody kind of has a take on things and has something to say. And there's a difference between like putting together something with a clear message versus, you know, just sort of coming at it from that angle. And that's something that you've covered in sort of visiting universities and speaking to students about sort of the ethics of that and like what you have the license to say, if I'm correct. Like how did you sort of make that part of something that you do in this field? Like why did that become a priority for you?
Well, the work that I do at WMHT isn't always the heroine work or the Dragon Lives Here work. Sometimes it's more stuff like I did a piece on William Kennedy, which is also important for your community to know, but it's not as much of an advocacy piece for your community. So when I've given the opportunity to teach or to speak in communities and talk about the power of that medium, I do that to try to like balance my own world and balance my own thoughts.
Yeah.
And I think that if you are going to call yourself a filmmaker and say that you're documenting, whether it be history or what's happening now or talking about the future, it's important to know that as an editor, you have a lot of responsibility to not jumble other people's words and to not put out into the world a different perspective than they were trying to talk to you about. Because when you interview somebody and you are the editor, you have a lot of power to kind of switch their words around and really mess with their message. And it's important that you understand your own ethic boundaries before you go and mess with somebody else's boundaries. And so I like to have that conversation and talk about, you know, just because somebody breaks down crying in front of the camera doesn't mean that that has to go on, where there's some news channels where that is their hot clip. But you need to know if that's something that you want to do or if they want you to do, and kind of discuss that inside yourself and figure that out.
There's been a lot of controversy lately in popular documentaries, whether it's Netflix or HBO, about the way footage is used and sound clips. Obviously, I think there's recently been a thing about the Jinx again, the way that a clip was used in that. And these are documentaries that I guess, you know, in some ways, they're going to get watched because they're on these larger things, but then they need that extra oomph. So maybe they're looking for that piece of news that might not have actually happened, but they're willing to force it. Yeah. Do you think that's become more of a thing now in this sort of age where this digital content is so valuable and sort of folks are, you know, looking to break through the noise when there's more of this? Or
yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that's really cool that's happened is documentaries have become a form of entertainment. Yeah. Like just 10 years ago, they were more of like a storytelling, history, perspective kind of piece that maybe wasn't so like flashy and interesting, and now people are actually using them as, you know, drama series, docudramas, and that's really fun because that means that we're interested in our own stories and not getting out there. But I think then people have a tendency to take those like hot moments where someone fell down or someone cried or someone swore and went off set and use that as like in their trailer as the thing to get you to watch that. Yeah. I think there's a balance, though, because you want people to watch your story and you want them to tune in, so you have to make it entertaining. So you are an entertainer, but you have to know, is that relevant to this story? If I take this out, is the story any weaker because they didn't see this person crying? Or does it make it stronger? Or how does it help the person's narrative that you're telling? And is it worth exploiting their feelings for that? Because they have to live with that afterwards, and my face is never shown, so I can walk away, but the person who I showed having a breakdown has to live with the fact that they had a breakdown. It gets spread on news networks everywhere.
Yeah, and just like social media, I feel like everyone loves to share those like little clips, even if they're like a few seconds. I mean, I think of like a guy from Fire Festival who, like, he went viral, and he, like, I was reading articles afterwards where he didn't know they were going to put that in the documentary, like, which is just crazy. I don't know, like, little things like that where it's like,
Well, that's a good example.
he's living with, like, sort of the fallback from that, and they were like, oh, this will be hilarious if we put this in here, and, like, everyone will want to watch it, but now
Right.
that's what he's known for. And
But that's also like the mission of that filmmaker, because I think
Right.
they wanted you to know what he was really like outside of when the camera was down or
Right.
when he wasn't talking to famous people.
Yeah.
So by putting that clip in, you have a different perspective of what he's really like. So maybe in that instance, they did a good job at trying to, like, revealing a character that wasn't getting revealed in another way. But then he has to deal with the fallback. So then you have to kind of ask yourself, is this a different story if this piece isn't in it, and is that the story I want to tell? And so I don't know what I would have done. Usually if I say I'm not filming, I'm not going to use it even if I was filming. I don't lie.
Yeah, but I mean, that must be a difficult thing to work through on a regular basis. Are there, like, I know we talked briefly about sort of like speaking to students who really thought of more of like the documentary and news filmmaking as like being on the front lines of something, or like going out and telling the most provocative stories. And I know one of your most interesting takes was like, you don't really have to go that far. I mean, it's right here. Whether that's a massive project like Dragon Lives Here, or like smaller stories about really important things that are happening right next door to someone that they may not know is going down.
I think that a lot of times the call to filmmaking is what students see on Vice News or these amazing pieces that are really necessary to see and to hear, and they have some like a star quality to them and a power quality to them. But the stories that aren't being told are the ones that are happening out on Broadway, and it's almost more of a sacrifice to stay here in Schenectady or Troy and really tell those stories and make those interesting enough that people want to listen to what's happening in their backyards. And sure, there's not as much glamour that comes along with them, or Grammys and
Right.
notoriety, but they're more important almost in some ways than they are if you went to these places that it's very obvious that there is an issue. That I'm not saying that in any way we shouldn't tell those bigger stories
Right.
too, but they stem from something local usually, and it's right outside.
Yeah. Like taking that opportunity because you're already here.
Yeah.
Might as well do it.
Yeah.
Are there any projects that you're working on right now that you're particularly excited to explore that you can talk about? I know I don't want to drop anything.
We're working on a couple. I think the one that's kind of in my forefront at WMHT is about Cafe Lena in Saratoga, and we're really digging into the history of that whole story about Lena, how she moved to Saratoga and opening the cafe, and that's given me a big insight into the folk history here, which is really interesting because it's a lot of activists and people who wanted change in their government and in their community, which it doesn't feel so far-fetched right now, and they just wanted a place to get together and talk about this stuff and listen to music, and that's what it really stemmed from. So it's fun to talk to people of a different generation about very similar circumstances that our community is in right now. Yeah.
I know WMHT is working on like a larger project that feels a little bit similar to that, right? It's like sort of going over like the local scene. It's called The Scene, where they're like, and I think that's still open, right, for people to sort of like share their stories or photos or anything about local musicians that they've seen here or venues, and there is such a deep personal connection to venues around here, and people feel really broken when they're gone, and they flip out on a pretty regular basis. But what I meant to say was like the venues change out, but people do flip out about losing their spots. But I mean, it has had such an important role in the arts community here, so I'm really interested to see that play out.
That'll be really fun because that's more of a nostalgic piece, and so there's a lot less journalism almost that goes into that, and it's the community just giving us stories.
Yeah.
Every day we're getting submissions. If you have pictures or stories, you should send them to WMHT. But it's finding out about, the Hullabaloo and trying to think there was one called the Showboat that was a literal boat that used to be parked in here in the 60s.
Nice.
I forget where it was. It wasn't quite around here, but there's all these places that I just wish were still here. And
Right.
there were people we just interviewed Michael Eck, who works here, and he just had a ton of stories. There was a leopard inside of the Hullabaloo that people used to go visit, and he just hung out in there. I'm not sure if that's like ethically, but people have stories about getting swatted in the head by it.
Oh my
and
God.
listening to music and watching the leopard, and it's just a different time.
Yeah.
Wish it was
for sure.
But not
That'd
the
be
leopard.
insane. Not the leopard. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I hope the leopard is in a better place.
Yeah.
I mean, for my generation, it's almost cliche now to lament the loss of the QE2, which was a venue that sort of died just as I left for college in the area. And a lot of people, have different relationships. The generation 2 or 3 before mine really lived in it, and their bands came up there and stuff like that. And it's still there, but it's more of the crowd and the people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different name and it's run differently, but still it's sort of the people that have moved on. It's not just that the venue is dead. So it's interesting to see that, and other places like Saratoga Winters, which absolutely burned down.
Yeah, that's actually gone.
Yeah.
A different kind of removal.
Yeah.
So you would say QE2 would be where you went, or?
Yeah, absolutely. In high school,
Valentine's.
that was Valentine's was sort of the after the QE2. QE2 had a very devoted following, to the point where like certain shows, they had these barn doors and people would be falling out of the barn doors, and it would be sweltering because there was no thing. It was like being packed in a tin can to see these absolutely violent and crazy shows and people hanging from the rafters, and it was like nothing I'd ever as a teenager seen before. And Valentine's got like that some points, but it was more of a variety, whereas QE2 was very much underground, and
Yeah.
it seemed like a dangerous place to a high schooler. Might not really have been, but it felt like, okay, this is punk music. This is sort of changing things,
Yeah.
and then it sort of ran its course before I even got to spend much time. So, but there are a lot of folks who are sick of hearing about it. But so it's interesting to see what and recent deaths in the music scene have sparked a lot of conversation. I was at a dinner the other night with relatives who were talking about Blotto and Greg Hames passing, and talking about all the venues they used to go to see those bands, and they're places that I had no idea had never hosted music or meant anything to anyone. So it is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to be able to document like those shifting cultures, because there are so many different groups of people that live in this region that feels so small but isn't, because there's so many different things going on and so many histories and stories to tell.
And everyone says the same venues. They talk about Blotto, so it's just like commonality between everyone, that if you talk about what were you doing, and it turns out you were all doing the same thing, and you thought you were being really different, and you were going out and you were rocking out, but we were all in the same fire code violated venues, having a good time while the floor wobbled, and we all remember that. So I mean, not me, I wasn't there, but the stories are there.
Yep.
I do think the fire codes have changed a lot. That's like my biggest takeaway from
Yeah. I mean, I actually did some set up roadie work in a couple of those places, and they were, well, for one, Saratoga Winters, which was like a former potato chip factory. They still had some of the stuff left over. I mean, upstairs in like these rafters, it was like Roadhouse, It was just, and there was a hole in the stage, and so it wasn't a surprise that it burned down. Of course, I think it was arson. It might have turned out that, but at the same time, it was like,
into the documentary.
yeah. Anyway, but yeah. But I was curious about the Dragon Lives Here in terms of, I think even, the Times Union stories, every time there is a story, it brings up debate about how much attention is being paid to it, because heroin is now sort of a wider epidemic and things like that. And, people are very vocal about it because it's something that occurs in communities and they're very familiar with now. And I'm wondering how you deal with feedback like that, or how much you hear from folks afterwards, and how you deal with that sort of feedback or criticism, or because obviously you're telling the best stories you can, you're trying to reach out, but it's a limited format. You're not going to tell everyone's story and everyone's experience. So how do you sort of, I mean, something that personal and visceral, how do you cope with that afterwards?
I take it too personally. I think that I need to do a better job of letting go and maybe not reading comments, even stuff, that we will post about the music scene. Someone's going to think we shouldn't have covered that, or that wasn't there. But I just try to get motivated by that. If they think that there is another perspective, then I want to find that. If there's somebody's story who I should share, then I want to find them and talk to them. A lot of times those comments come from a place of hurt already, and they feel like they haven't been heard, or like somebody isn't listening to them. And if they paid a little bit more attention to what we were doing, they would, a lot of times there's not a lot of research that goes into those, like the really harsh comments. And we don't get a lot of them. Luckily, PBS comes with like a good moral values behind it, and like a solid name for the most part. But definitely, if someone says something, I think about like, well, did I tell that story? Am I doing this because of that? Is there a reason that I'm only talking to these people? And if there is, then I try to reflect on that. But lots of the times there's a response where like, well, if you go back to the last episode, you'll see that we did discuss that.
Right. Because
it's really just like a visceral reaction, that they are upset about something, which is probably legitimate too.
And I'm also curious, I understand you did do roller derby, something. So how do you find inspiration in the community that feeds into your work? Are you part of a creative scene locally that you feel, strengthens what you do at WMHT?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of my friends are very creative. I think it's very easy just to go in downtown Troy and meet a bunch of creative people. It's hard to get away from them here.
Yeah.
So just like leave your house and you'll find someone that inspires you. I mean, all of my friends are either musicians in filmmaking, graphic artists, illustrators. They are killing it. Like they're doing so well. I'm sure that you've probably interviewed most of them, but they drive me. But also I like to really put myself outside of my comfort zone a lot and say yes to things when I maybe should say no. And one of them was a roller derby poster. Oh. And it was like I'd never roller skated before. I'm 6 feet tall. Most roller derby players are like 5'5", and I just wanted to try something different, and it was painful and really fun. It was a good time.
That's great. So do you have a site or somewhere where people can find sort of a collective of all the work that you've done?
Well, I'd say like for me personally, my LinkedIn page really brings you to a lot of the projects I've worked on in different areas of my life.
Awesome.
But you can also go to WMHT.org and it kind of links you to all the different projects we're working on.
Check everything out.
All the producers there, they're very hardworking.
Yeah, I know that's something that we also talked about, is sort of like how a lot of the producers there are kind of like working together to try new things and explore new ways of telling the story, and like get away from that sort of like old form of documentary or like even just regular PBS features in terms of
and some of it works and some of it doesn't work, and we just try to grab a camera and go out sometimes and talk to people, and that's been really well received. We did a short series for a while called Field Trip, and we just went places where we could go because we had access to through work that you might not be able to go find out where the Cookie Factory cookies were made, but we could. Yeah. So we just did that for 2 hours and then put it online and called it a day. And that was really fun. We met a lot of people and made a lot of connections that way, just getting to know our community better. And got cookies. So
that's the most important part.
I mean, that's journalism right there. That's a good day in journalism.
Yeah. That's definitely exploiting your ability, but
Awesome. Well, so everybody go check out WMHT and the exciting new projects that they have going on, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for
Appreciate
having me.
it.